Hi, and welcome to the third and final part of The World's Worst Witch to the Rescue by Jill Murphy, continuing from Chapter 13. Einstein hunched himself deep within his shell as Ethel lowered him into a cardboard box, which also contained the toad that Ethel had used for the animal spell during Miss Hardbroom's class. There were air holes punched in the lid, and Einstein emerged from his shell and stretched his long neck upwards and tilted his head. "Are you okay?" whispered the toad. "Shh," said Einstein. "I'm trying to listen." Ethel and Drusilla were hatching a plan which involved a very tall pine tree just outside the school gates, with a hollow near the top, big enough to hide a tortoise in. They were discussing whether to rig up a barrier at the entrance so that he wouldn't fall out. Drusilla was in favour of this, but Ethel wasn't. "He'll be fine. There's no need to make such a fuss. He won't fall out anyway," she explained to her friend. "If he really can speak, I'll just tell him not to leave the hollow, or he'll smash himself to bits. We'll wait until HB's done her rounds and fly him up there. It'll only take 5 minutes. "Shouldn't we leave him something to eat?" asked Drusilla. "I suppose so," said Ethel grudgingly. "We can pick up some carrots and lettuce from the kitchen dustbins on our way out. You better go back to your room now and get some sleep. I'll come and fetch you later on." Einstein pulled his head away from the air holes. "Sorry about that," he said politely to the toad. "I just wanted to know what they were going to do with me. I must admit I am petrified of being left on my own at the top of a tree. It goes very badly for tortoises if we drop from a height." "What happens if you do?" asked the toad. "I'd rather not go into details, if you don't mind," replied Einstein in a quavering voice. "Let's just say we always avoid being up high. We get claustrophobia too, so a small hollow at the top of a tall tree is just about the worst thing that can happen to a tortoise." "Is there anything I can do to help?" asked the toad. Einstein pondered for a moment. "Yes, there is actually," he said. "When this Ethel person takes me to the prison in the sky, I'd like you to set off and find Mildred Hubbell's room. It's 3 doors from here if you turn left on the other side of the corridor. Tell her that Einstein is in the hollow pine outside the school gates. That way I might get rescued before there's a gale or some other mishap." "I'll try," said the toad. "Trouble is, I'm not very good at jumping like frogs do. Perhaps I can lean up against the side of the box so it falls to one side. There's a big enough gap under this door for me to flatten myself and crawl under. Toads are good at flattening. Einstein's a very nice name, by the way. Mine is Cyril." "Pleased to meet you, Cyril," said Einstein. "Pleased to meet you too," said the toad, "and I really will try my best to get assistance if I can possibly manage it." Chapter 14. Along the corridor, Mildred huddled in her bed, listening to the wind rising outside the glassless window. Tabby had burrowed right under the bedclothes to get out of the draught, which was already so strong that Mildred's hair was blowing about on the pillow. She had undone her usual plaits and given the hair a thorough brushing before she'd gone to bed, and now it was dancing about all over the place, reminding her of the dreadful occasion last term when she'd tried out a regrowth spell and her hair had taken off at such a fantastic speed that it had practically engulfed the whole school. She sat up in bed and started replaiting it to keep it under control. "Oh, Tabs," she said miserably, "I wonder where on earth Einstein has got to. If I had any idea I'd go and fetch him, but I haven't a clue." Einstein was, just as Ethel had said, in the hollow at the top of the tallest pine outside the school gate. Ethel hadn't relished the idea of being caught herself, so she persuaded Drusilla to get dressed again and do the deed in her place. She gave her precise instructions how to creep within the dark shadow of the school, then zoom over the wall and hover up behind the pine trees so she would be covered by the forest. Einstein was in a pea bag across her shoulder underneath her cloak. He was tempted to try and plead with Drusilla, but he could tell that it would be useless by the way they had talked about him. Drusilla hovered next to the hollow, which fortunately dropped lower inside than the entrance, lifted Einstein out and placed him in the musty depths with a handful of cabbage leaves and apple peelings. "Ethel says don't try and get out, or you'll fall 30 metres, okay?" said Drusilla helpfully. Einstein stayed tucked up inside his shell and didn't move. Drusilla tapped the shell. "Did you hear that?" she shouted. "Don't try and escape, or you'll fall. We'll come and get you soon." Then she was gone, and Einstein was left alone in the pine tree, which was already bending from side to side in a most alarming way. The minute Ethel had taken Einstein out of the box and crept off to Drusilla's room, Cyril had set to work on his rescue plan. Fortunately, the lid of the box was not very tight-fitting, and he found that he could dislodge it by jumping a short distance and bashing it with his head, like heading a football. Then it was quite easy to stand on tiptoe and jump enough to land half and half on the top edge and sliver down the other side. The box was on the bedside locker, which was quite a height from the floor, but Cyril aimed for Ethel's school bag, which broke his fall. After that he was soon squeezing himself flat underneath the door and out into the shadowy corridor. So far so good, he thought proudly. Mildred had finished replaiting her hair, moved her bed away from the window in case of rain and snuggled right under the bed covers. The wind outside had begun to roar and moan in the pine trees, sounding like a stormy sea. She was so far down the bed that she didn't hear the tiny sound of a toad flapping his feet against the heavy wooden door. Cyril was outside, tapping as hard as he could with a back and front foot. He had tried to squeeze underneath, but the space was far smaller than the gap below Ethel's door. "Excuse me," he called out in his tiny toad voice. Fortunately, cats can detect the very smallest sound and movement. Tabby wriggled out from under the bedclothes and rushed over to the crack beneath the door, where he started scrabbling with his paw. Mildred got out of bed and lit her candle. "What is it, Tab?" she asked. "Is someone there? Is it Einstein?" She opened the door and saw Cyril, still with his front and back leg upraised to continue his attempt at knocking. "Oh, hello," he said, relieved to see her. "Are you Mildred Hubble?" Mildred bent down and picked the little toad up very carefully. "I am," she whispered. "Brilliant," said Cyril. "I'm Cyril. I was Ethel Hallow's demonstration toad in the potion lab today. I brought you a message from Einstein." Chapter 15. Mildred sat on her bed listening to the message from her lost tortoise with a sinking heart. "Are you sure she took him all the way up there?" she asked, clutching at straws. "Perhaps she just put him in a cupboard in Drusilla's room." "No, it was the hollow pine outside the school gates," insisted Cyril. "She was really definite about it." "But it's about 30 metres high," said Mildred. "The other trees are really tall anyway, but that one's a good 3 metres above the others." She closed her eyes, imagining going out on a rescue mission on such an awful night, when 5 minutes ago she'd been tucked up with Tabby, thinking how nice it felt to be safe and warm inside. "He's terrified of heights," continued Cyril relentlessly. "He might fall out, and the wind's getting worse. I think there's going to be a storm." As if to underline his words, the wind rose to a screaming pitch, and a squall of rain suddenly lashed against the castle walls, spraying an arc of drops through the narrow window. "He really is scared," said Cyril. "His voice went all wobbly when he told me where they were taking him. I promised I'd ask you to help. Will you help?" "Of course I will," said Mildred, trying hard to sound confident and capable. "I'll just fetch my broom." Tabby burrowed back under the covers at the mention of the word broom. Mildred sat on the edge of the bed and stroked him reassuringly. "It's okay, Tab," she said gently. "This is an illegal mission, so you're excused broomstick duty tonight." She turned to the toad. "Where would you like to go, Cyril, now that your task is done?" "Could you pop me back outside the school gate?" said Cyril. "Then I can make my way down through the forest. I love this sort of weather, actually. It's very good for the complexion." Mildred glanced at the toad's dry and knobbly skin and stifled a giggle. Up in the hollow pine, Einstein was trying hard not to panic. The wind had set up a constant moan, with sudden bursts of extra force that felt as if they would snap the already weak and hollowed tree in two. "She isn't going to come," thought Einstein dismally. "The whole tree will disintegrate and I'll be smashed into tiny pieces." He tried keeping himself tightly hidden inside his shell, but the horrible noise outside was so frightening that he couldn't stop himself coming out to check. The darkness all around him and the rain spraying in through the entrance made him feel even worse, so he retreated inside his shell. Then he came out again, and then he went back in again. In the end, he did this so many times he was beside himself with exhausted confusion. "Please come and get me out of here, Mildred Hubble," he said desperately. "Please." Mildred was doing her best. She had decided not to involve Maud or Enid this time. When she imagined waking Maud up and announcing that she needed help rescuing an escaped tortoise from the top of the tallest pine tree in the forest, in the middle of a gale, she could hear how ridiculous it sounded. "No, Mildred," she said to herself, "you're on your own with this one." The summer dress was too flimsy for an adventure like this, so Mildred put her school cardigan on over her pyjamas to keep a bit warmer and tucked the trouser ends into her socks. She wrapped her cloak around her, tied it in the middle with her school sash to stop it blowing about, and set off to the schoolyard, the toad in one hand and her trusty broom in the other. When she reached the side door, which was smaller and easier to unbolt, she was suddenly struck with terror as she looked out into the rain-swept, noisy darkness. Mildred was afraid of the dark, a most embarrassing problem for a trainee witch, and it didn't get much darker and more frightening than the night waiting for her outside. "He must be petrified all the way up there," said Cyril, as if reading her thoughts. "Just put me down here if you like. It's only a short hop to the gates, and there's a 10-centimetre gap for me to squeeze under." "All right," said Mildred. "Thank you so much for telling me where he is. I'm sure we'll be okay once I've found the tree." For a mad moment she wondered if she might ask Cyril to come with her for company, as she watched him hop and flop down the steps and disappear into the storm. "What am I thinking about?" she asked herself. "Making friends with a toad. It's funny how perfectly he speaks English, though. I wonder if I lived in a different country, would the toad speak in that language? And does the spell adapt to any language in the world? Perhaps I've discovered an international spell. Mildred Hubble, international spell maker." At that moment a gust of wind banged the door loudly back against the inside corridor. Mildred grabbed it and waited nervously, straining her ears to hear if anyone had noticed, but no one came. She decided to take a lantern from the corridor and tied it onto the front of her broom to light her way. The only thing to use was her sash, which she took from her waist, causing the cloak to billow out around her. "Okay, broom," she said, trying to sound like a person in charge. "Hover." "That's right." Mildred stepped outside with the broom doing its best to keep steady in the gusting wind. The door slammed deafeningly shut behind her. "Can't be helped," thought Mildred desperately, as she arranged herself side saddle on the broom and tucked her cloak firmly underneath her. "Okay, little broom, up, up, up and over the wall." Chapter 16. Miss Harbroom was having a late evening cup of hot chocolate with Miss Cackle in Miss Cackle's study. "There's a door banging downstairs somewhere," said Miss Cackle, offering Miss Harbroom a biscuit from a large tin. "Sounds like a nasty storm's brewing out there." "Very nasty," agreed Miss Harbroom, taking a custard cream and resting it in her saucer. "I was just wondering, Miss Cackle, how much longer we have to plough on trying to educate Mildred Hubble in this establishment." "Why?" asked Miss Cackle, looking up from the tin, where she was trying to decide whether to take a chocolate biscuit or a pink wafer, or maybe both. "What's she done now?" "Everything," said Miss Harbroom wearily. "It would take all night to list the events, and we've only been back for one day. I don't think I have the stamina to struggle through the entire term trying to keep Mildred Hubble in some sort of order. I honestly don't know how she does it. She's a sort of trouble magnet." "But rather sweet, don't you think?" said Miss Cackle, with a fond smile. "Always considering others, and such a good owner to that hopeless cat of hers." "That's all very well," said Miss Harbroom crisply, "but having a rather sweet nature doesn't necessarily equip a girl to be a suitable pupil at this school, the finest witches' academy for miles around." "The only witches' academy for miles around," laughed Miss Cackle, attempting to inject a little humour before her colleague plunged into an endless list of Mildred's faults. "What's that?" asked Miss Harbroom, suddenly peering out of the window. "What's what?" asked Miss Cackle, getting up reluctantly from her comfortable armchair. "Look," said Miss Harbroom, "there's a light flickering over there." "Where, Miss Harbroom?" said Miss Cackle. "I can't see anything." "Just outside the gates," said Miss Harbroom. "It's disappeared now. No, there it is, higher up. It looks like a giant firefly." "We don't have any giant fireflies, do we?" asked Miss Cackle hopefully. "They don't actually exist, Miss Cackle," said Miss Harbroom witheringly. "I'd better go and check." "Surely not, Miss Harbroom," exclaimed Miss Cackle. "You mustn't go out there on such a night. I'm sure it's nothing." "It looks like a definite something to me," said Miss Harbroom sternly. "It keeps disappearing and then reappearing several metres higher up. Definitely something enough to investigate." Chapter 17. Mildred was hovering her way very slowly and carefully up towards the top of the trees outside the school gates. She couldn't tell which one was the hollow pine yet, but figured that she might be able to see it by its extra height when she reached the very top. She knew it was right in front of the gates, which was a help. The wind was especially ferocious this far up, getting stronger the higher she rose, and the valiant broomstick kept lurching every time it was hit by a particularly strong gust or a cannon burst of rain. Mildred's unsecured cloak didn't help, billowing like a sail or suddenly twisting above her like a faulty parachute. Every now and then she ducked behind the front row of trees and held onto a branch to have a rest, out of the full force of the storm. The trouble was that if you tried to hover behind the first row of trees, you were blown into the ones behind, which grew very close together. The best way to ascend was, unfortunately, out in the open, even though it was very difficult to keep your balance. During one such rest, gasping to keep her breath back, Mildred suddenly felt a glow of pride that she was able to control a broomstick in these freak conditions. "It's funny what you can do when it's an emergency," she thought. "Better get going again before my luck runs out." "Einstein," she called. "Einstein, where are you?" But the wind whisked her voice away like a thistledown. Einstein was trying very hard and not succeeding to pull himself together. His head, legs and tail were zooming in and out of his shell like an insane cuckoo clock, and he was muttering to himself, attempting to take his mind off the fact that the tree was now making ominous, deep creaking sounds. When he saw the flickering light from Mildred's broom outside the entrance to the hollow, he thought it was lightning, and this was the very last straw. Yelling one last desperate "Help!" he pulled himself back into the deepest depths of his shell and switched off. "Einstein?" yelled Mildred, just catching the help above the lashing rain. "Where are you?" Mildred wobbled her way towards the place where she thought the voice had come from, and the light from the lantern caught the edge of the hollow. She flew to the entrance and hung on to the scrubby branches so that the lantern lit up the inside of the hollow and Einstein's closed-up shell. "It's all right, Einstein," Mildred exclaimed. "I'm here. I'll have to button you inside my cardigan so you don't fall. Don't be scared. I'll hold you very tightly. I won't let you fall." Steadying herself by clutching the edge of the hollow with one hand, she gently lifted the terrified tortoise out with the other and peered into the deep cave-like area at the front of his shell. where he had retracted himself so far that he was invisible. "Say something, Ainsy," she said affectionately, buttoning him tightly inside her cardigan in case the exhausted broomstick lurched in the wind and threw them both off. "You're safe now. I'll have you down in a jiffy. We'll be back in the warm before you know it." Chapter 18. Going down was so much more pleasant than going up, as the wind diminished in strength towards the forest floor. Mildred breathed a sigh of relief when her feet bounced on the grass, and she could finally stand upright again, although she felt slightly unsteady, rather like the feeling you have when you've been on a boat for a long time and finally reached land. "Come on, Einstein," she said, peering down the front of her cardigan. "Speak to me. You're okay now? We're on planet Earth again. Isn't this just my luck? The best broomstick handling I've ever done and no one to witness it." "Just one witness, Mildred Hubble," said the most unwelcome voice that Mildred could possibly hear. "Miss Hardbroom," exclaimed Mildred, jumping right off her feet in horrified surprise as she saw her former mistress wrapped in a sodden cloak, standing close behind her, holding up a lantern. Oh, Miss Hardbroom, I know this looks bad, but—" "Spare me the sound of your voice for a few minutes, Mildred," said Miss Hardbroom, smoothing back a tendril of dripping hair. "Let's get out of this wind before you launch into the usual raving explanation of your tiresome behaviour. Miss Cackle is waiting in her study." Miss Cackle was just making a second cup of hot chocolate when her study door crashed open and a dripping Miss Hardbroom swept in, guiding the drenched Mildred in front of her. "Oh, my goodness," exclaimed Miss Cackle. "Miss Hardbroom, Mildred, come over here and stand by the fire. Mildred, take off that wet cloak and cardigan at once. Miss Hardbroom, please remove your cloak and get yourself warm. You'll both catch pneumonia in all those wet things." Mildred wrestled her way out of the cloak, which had twisted itself like a scarf around her shoulders, and began very carefully to unbutton her cardigan. Miss Cackle was watching her intently, waiting to take the wet garments and drape them near the fire. So there was no hiding Einstein, who was still lurking deep inside his shell. "Good gracious me," said Miss Cackle. "Is that a tortoise, Mildred?" "Yes, Miss Cackle," said Mildred bleakly. "He's called Einstein. He can speak, Miss Cackle, but he's been so upset, being up in the tree, that I think he's gone into his shell. If you see what I mean, with the shock of it all. Tortoises are really afraid of heights, and they have terrible claustrophobia, so it's no wonder he's in shock." "How did he get up there in the tree in the first place, Mildred?" asked Miss Hardbroom in a matter-of-fact voice. "They don't fly, as well as having claustrophobia and a fear of heights, do they? Or is this just another little known fact about tortoises that only you are privileged to know?" "Someone took him up there, Miss Hardbroom," said Mildred. "Do you happen to know who that someone was, Mildred?" asked Miss Cackle. "I think it was Ethel Hallow, Miss Cackle," said Mildred miserably. "And how do you know it was Ethel?" asked Miss Hardbroom. Her toad told me," said Mildred, realising how mad this sounded. "You know, the one she used today in potions. He's called Cyril. He could speak, so he hopped along to tell me what had happened. He knocked on the door with his feet and—" "So where is the toad now, Mildred?" asked Miss Hardbroom. "I let him go," said Mildred. "In the yard. They don't mind the rain. In fact, they actually prefer it. And he wanted to go home." Miss Hardbroom stared in wonder, first at Mildred and then at Miss Cackle. "Where did the tortoise come from, Mildred?" asked Miss Cackle, looking totally baffled. "I think this is going to be a very long story, Headmistress," said Miss Hardbroom. "I'll take charge of the traumatised tortoise for the night, and we can assemble the relevant pupils and the tortoise at some point tomorrow. Not Cyril, though, as pity as I'm sure he could fill us in on all the several important details." "Could I keep Einstein with me, Miss Hardbroom?" asked Mildred desperately. "He still hasn't come out of his shell, and I'm really worried about him." "He'll be quite safe with me, Mildred," said Miss Hardbroom. "You may take a hot bath to warm yourself up, but be quick about it." "Could we have the meeting early, Miss Hardbroom?" asked Mildred. "It's just that the spell only works until noon, and he won't be able to speak again after that." Miss Hardbroom held the shell up and looked into the dark interior, where Einstein's front legs were pulled in tightly to shield him from view. "Are you sure he can speak, Mildred?" she asked. "Perhaps he's hibernating," said Miss Cackle brightly. "They're just coming out of hibernation at this time of year, Miss Cackle," said Miss Hardbroom waspishly. "Tomorrow morning then, Mildred, before assembly." "Oh, thank you so much, Miss Hardbroom," said Mildred gratefully. "And please, could you put him somewhere nice and warm? They hate the cold, and he's had such a terrible time." "I do know a little bit about tortoises, Mildred," said Miss Hardbroom. "Now off to bed with you, and don't forget the hot bath." Chapter 19. Bright and early next morning there was a tap on Mildred's door while she was still getting dressed, ready to go down to breakfast. Mildred opened the door and found a nervous-looking first year named Mavis standing outside. "What is it?" asked Mildred, trying to sound kindly. The first years looked so small and shy, and Mildred remembered only too well what she felt like. "I brought a message from Miss Hardbroom," said Mavis. "She wants to see you in Miss Cackle's study right away." "OK, Maeve," said Mildred, Message received. Off you go and ask Maud to save me some toast, would you? Of course, replied Mavis proudly, glad to be of assistance to Mildred Hubble, whose adventures were legendary throughout the school. Mildred brushed and replaited her hair as tightly as possible and smoothed her dress, hoping to make a good impression from the first moment of what could prove to be a very difficult interview. Mildred knocked firmly on Miss Cackle's door. Come in, Mildred, said Miss Cackle, beckoning her inside. Take a seat. Mildred was the last to arrive. Miss Cackle and Miss Harbroom were already seated on one side of the desk, and Ethel was sitting bolt upright on the other, looking annoyed. Einstein, still invisible inside his shell, had been placed in Miss Cackle's overflowing in-tray, which made rather a comfortable nest for him. Now then, girls, continued Miss Cackle, let's try and get to the bottom of the extraordinary story which Mildred began last night. Mildred, would you like to tell Ethel what you said to us yesterday, when Miss Harbroom brought you in from the storm? Ethel's eyes had narrowed into slits, but Mildred took a deep breath and began. I had to rescue Einstein. That's my tortoise's name. From the hollow pine, Ethel, she said firmly. Your toad, you know, the one you used to demonstrate my spell, the spell you stole from me. Well, your toad came with a message that you'd hidden Einstein up in the hollow pine tree, and he asked me to go and get him, so I did. That's all, really. All, thundered Miss Harbroom. That sounds like a very long list of accusations to me, Mildred. Well, Ethel, what do you have to say? I'm stunned, Miss Harbroom, exclaimed Ethel. I don't know what she's talking about. I certainly didn't go anywhere last night. I was fast asleep in bed, and I never stole her spell. Why on earth would I want to steal a spell from Mildred Hubble? You'd have to be mad to steal a spell from her. It'd probably turn you into a cockroach or something. I don't know how to convince you, Miss Harbroom. I definitely didn't go out last night. If someone put him there, it certainly wasn't me. There was silence for a few moments, while everyone looked at each other, and then Miss Cackle spoke. Well, if you didn't, Ethel, she asked, who did? I think you'll find that her name was Drusilla, said a small rasping voice. Everyone jumped as they saw that Einstein had emerged from his shell and was blundering through the papers to the edge of the in-tray. Einstein, exclaimed Mildred joyfully, you've come out. Are you all right? Yes, yes, said the little tortoise, stretching his long neck and all four legs one after the other. Don't fuss. I was just a bit upset last night and I thought I'd take a very long nap. Now then, my friend, what would you like to know? Everything, really, said Mildred, from when you wandered out of my bedroom till I found you in the hollow tree. Was it you who rescued me? Asked Einstein. I wondered how I got back down here again. It was such a horrible night and I was so scared. Thank you so much. Well, let me think. Oh yes, I went for a walk and Drusilla found me, took me to Ethel's room. Ethel was just bringing me back to you when she overheard you and your friends saying that I could talk. So she told Drusilla that she was going to hide me up in the pine until the speaking spell ran out. She was going to give me back to you after that, I remember her saying. Can you remember anything else? Asked Mildred hopefully. Do you remember what Ethel and I talked about when we were sitting in that tree on our way to school? I don't remember that, said Einstein, but I do remember what she said to Drusilla in her bedroom. She said that she knocked your bag down the tree on purpose and she borrowed your project, and that she threw it into the kitchen bin after she copied it out. Oh yes, and she said something about trying out a snake spell on your pot. She didn't seem to want to go out on such an awful night, so she talked Drusilla into it instead. But it was Ethel's idea. She made Drusilla do it. Anything else you'd like to know? Chapter 20. Down in the yard behind the kitchen, standing next to the huge bin, which had been turned on its side, Miss Cackle, Miss Harbroom and Mildred watched as Ethel sifted through old bits of pie and custard and a mass of burnt porridge, still warm from the cauldron when the cooks had prepared breakfast. Keep looking, Ethel, said Miss Harbroom menacingly. We're going to turn over every old tea bag, every fish skin, until we find Mildred's project. Ethel sat back on her heels, looking desperate. It's not fair, Miss Harbroom, she said. I don't know how you can believe the word of a tortoise against mine. There it is, exclaimed Mildred, diving into a pile of incinerated toast. I can see it. It's my handwriting book. Look. Mildred held up her project, tea-stained and damp, but still recognisable as her treasured work. Miss Harbroom took it from her with one finger and thumb and looked at it sideways. Well, well, she said coolly to Ethel. I never thought that I would take the word of a tortoise above yours, Ethel, but it would seem that he is the more honest of the two of you. Now then, Ethel, before you try and wriggle out of this, let me ask you, did you steal Mildred's project? Did you turn Mildred's pot into a snake? And did you ask Drusilla to imprison this poor creature at the top of the hollow pine? Take your time, Ethel. I want a truthful answer from you. Ethel knew that she was cornered and in the worst trouble she'd ever been, with no way out. I did everything, Miss Harbroom, she muttered. The snake pot, the project, and I got Drusilla to hide the tortoise, because he knew too much. I'm sorry I lied. I'm sorry about everything. Maud and Enid were in the middle of breakfast, when Mildred dashed in to join them. She was glowing from head to foot and smiling so broadly that it looked as if her head might fall off. "What's happened, Millie?" asked Maud, passing her the 2 slices of toast that they'd kept for her. "You look as if you might go into orbit." "Oh, it's wonderful, Maud," said Mildred. "Ethel's actually confessed to HB and Miss Cackle that she stole my project. She'd thrown it into the kitchen bin and HB made her look through all the slimy rubbish till she found it. Then she confessed that she'd turned my pot into rattlesnakes, and she admitted that she'd got Drusilla to hide Einstein up the tree last night." "Up what tree?" asked Enid. "Oh, I forgot," said Mildred. "All that happened while you were asleep. I'll tell you about it later. I'll just stuff down this toast and I'll be starving at assembly." Chapter 21. Miss Cackle and Miss Hardbroom stood on the platform with the other teachers looking down on the girls as they ploughed through their daily rendition of the school song. As the last notes faded away, Miss Cackle stepped forward and smiled at her flock. "Good morning, girls," she said fondly, "and what a good morning it is indeed for Mildred Hubble. Step up here, Mildred, and Ethel Hallow. I think Ethel has something important to say to you, Mildred." Mildred and Ethel both looked at the floor as they made their way up to the steps to stand under the steely gaze of Miss Hardbroom, Ethel wishing the ground would swallow her up and caught out in such a torrent of lies. Mildred self-conscious as she felt hundreds of pairs of eyes watching her curiously. "Various unpleasant events have happened since the beginning of this term," announced Miss Hardbroom, and the evidence unfortunately pointed to Mildred Hubble as the culprit. "I have to tell you all that Mildred was entirely innocent of any blame whatsoever. Not only has she written the best holiday project that I have ever seen, she also carried out the heroic rescue of a poor dumb animal. Well, not so dumb actually, in the middle of a virtual hurricane." Ethel Hallow took Mildred's spell and passed it off as her own. "I'm not surprised that you wanted it, Ethel, but you can't just take something that doesn't belong to you, nor must you use spell making to wreck the work of someone who is better than you in that subject. I think an apology is in order, Ethel." "Sorry, Mildred," mumbled Ethel, staring at her shoes. "Louder, please, Ethel," said Miss Hardbroom, "so that the whole school can hear." "Sorry, Mildred," said Ethel in a strangled voice. "It was a brilliant spell, the best idea ever. I wish it really had been mine." "Thanks, Ethel," said Mildred shyly, pleased that Ethel had admitted everything, however grudgingly. "I'm sure you'll think up one of your own in no time." After assembly there was a double broomstick lesson in the yard for Form 3, which took them right up to lunchtime. "You must be so pleased, Millie," said Maud, flinging an arm around Mildred's shoulder as the lunch bell rang out. "Everything's turned out so well, and the one thing HB can't stand is dishonesty, so Ethel's really got to watch out now or she'll be for the chop." "I know," said Mildred, smiling, "and Miss Cackle felt so sorry for me about the snake pot incident after I'd done so well that she's going to let us have a proper craft room with a kiln and everything. But the best thing of all is that I get to keep Einstein as an extra pet. Einstein!" She dropped her broomstick with a clatter and raced for the door into school. "What's the matter, Mill?" yelled Enid. "It's 12 o'clock, Mildred called back. "I won't have time to have a last chat with him before the spell breaks." Mildred leapt up the front steps, dashed along the corridor and up the spiral staircase, 2 steps at a time. She whirled into her room and lay down flat on the floor so she could see Einstein, who was sitting happily in the open doorway of the cat basket under her bed. "Einstein," said Mildred softly, "can you still speak? Say something, please." "I'm glad I belong to you," said Einstein, speaking for the last time in his rasping little voice. Then he picked up his carrot and began munching it, gazing vacantly into space, and looking for all the world like a tortoise with only one brain cell. "And I'm glad you're mine," said Mildred, smoothing his knobbly shell. "You too," she added, laughing as Tabby landed on her back, meowing loudly. She felt the same sudden surge of hope that she had felt the day before, when everything had looked so promising. Perhaps it is going to be a brilliant term after all. And that is the end of The Worst Witch to the Rescue by Jill Murphy. Hope you enjoyed that story, guys. I'll be back soon with lots more stories and lots more videos coming your way. If you'd like to subscribe or hit a like, that's always appreciated. Thanks for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.